Welcome everyone to DRJ's webinar series. I'm Bob Arnold, President here at Disaster Coverage Journal. We thank your attendance today and we hope you gather some great information from today's webinar. Everyone's phone has been muted and we ask you to utilize the question panel found on the right-hand side of your screen. Our speaker today will attempt to answer as many of these as possible at the end of the webinar. Today's sponsor is Strategic BCP. Today's topic is Deciphering Overlapping Standard and Requirements using the BCP Genome. Our speaker today is Frank Perlmutter. Frank is a former manager of DR and COOP for the U.S. Department of Treasury. He is currently the president and co-founder of Strategic BCP, creators of Resilience One. He has also managed BC risk process improvement programs for more than 100 organizations over the past 17 years. With no further introductions, I'd like to welcome and turn the mic over to Frank.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Bob. Really, I think it's going to be a great webinar today. We're going to have a lot of time, too, I think, for questions at the end about some of the specific standards and regulations or anything about setting up a framework. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get right into the content of the presentation and take you through what we're going to be going over today. One of the biggest things, obviously, is why do this? You know, why should we care about the different regulations, standards, and best practices? Why are they important for you, not just from a compliance standpoint, but also from a guidance standpoint and how you're doing your day-to-day activities and jobs? We're going to talk about the business continuity planning genome that we developed back in 2006 and we've evolved. It's essentially a combination of many different standards, essentially the framework that we use here at Strategic BCP. And from that, from our work with that, we'll tell you about the process, we'll tell you about the results from that, and those will deliver some lessons learned on how you can set up your own framework to both meet those compliance and the resilience goals. We'll talk about a lot of the specific standards, the regulations, the best practices, where are their strengths, where are their weaknesses on there. I think that we've been discussing this beforehand amongst our clients and our colleagues too. I think you're going to see some really nice surprises in there too, so definitely stay around for that. And then how you would get to a gold standard, your own gold standard. So with questions and answers and wrapping up the webinar. Okay, so we're going to start with what exactly are regulations, standards, and also the best practices too. So just a couple of definitions on here. Regulations are mandatory authoritative rules. So there's your dictionary definition there of regulations and of standards and best practices. The big words to understand on here, the most important ones, are that regulations are mandatory. You have to do those. No surprise there. Standards and best practices, they're not voluntary guidelines. So things that you don't necessarily have to abide to, but can provide you guidance in improving your process, starting the business continuity program, and continuously delivering that. So both of those things, real important to understand the difference in between the two and how we can use a combination of those together to establish a framework. So why should you care about these different areas on here? Obviously, regulations, you're obligated to care. You have to. If you don't do them, there's penalties either internally or externally for not complying to the specific standards. So specific industries, financial services, and in healthcare, energy industries, the federal government, your client standards, you have to do those things. If you don't do those things, you're going to get in trouble. And for the best practices and also for the different standards, they can provide you guidance. And as I just mentioned, all along the continuum of your business continuity process, getting it started, providing a process for actually developing the different content that goes into it, delivering it to your constituents, your executives, and also the people that are also utilizing your program and helping you build your plans. How can you overall manage that program to be effective, How can you monitor it? And obviously, how can you evaluate it and audit it to make sure that you're continuously meeting those different regulation standards and best practices? So those 2 points are of paramount importance as to why we actually look at these different standards. So as we move forward on here, what we want to do, as I mentioned before, we want to look at a lot of the lessons learned when we were mapping our own framework, look at the different strengths and weaknesses of not all the different standards. There's quite a few out there, but on some of the ones that we saw that maybe weren't as sufficient as we thought they were, and some that were very sufficient when combined together to build the framework. And then obviously moving forward to evaluate how you're currently doing things with your tools and methodologies, how you can implement or fine-tune your program. So those are the 3 webinar goals today. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to start with what exactly is this business continuity genome on here, and how did we get to it? Okay, so here's what it was. We started with a mission. The mission started and the project started in 2006. So this has been going on now for over 7 years. The goal of developing our framework called the genome was to develop a gold standard, and based upon all of the different collective thought leadership within the industry. So in other words, the thought leadership was in these standards and regulations and best practices. And what we wanted to do was we wanted to look at them, look at the content very carefully, and we didn't want to interpret the standards to say, hey, this content in here is bad, this or good, but basically to just take the content and synthesize it all together. So in essence, just taking all of the different points and putting them into one consistent framework. In essence, just a combination of all of the thought leadership, of all of the different points of the standards, regs, and best practices, and put it all into that business continuity planning genome. So that's exactly what we did. Rule number 1 is very important. It's not the world according to strategic BCP. It's the world according to the industry. So here's how we started. What we did was we selected 9 standards, regs, and best practices to establish the original framework. And we went point by point through each of those different standards and regs and best practices. I'm going to refer to these all as standards from now on, so I don't have to keep on saying standards, regs, and best practices. So as we went through each of the different points, we started to map them into the framework. And one very interesting thing that we noticed was that after we did 4 of them, the core framework was developed. We had all of the different points of our framework. When we kept on going with each of the additional standards that we were mapping, what we saw was that the remaining standards were redundant to the points that we mapped. So it was very interesting. There's a lot, the thought leadership is very repetitive and redundant, and that's not such a bad thing. It was consistent. So what we wound up doing was, with the original points that we mapped, was that we were essentially just fine-tuning those in those remaining 5 standards. So 4 plus 5 got us the original 9. Here was the result. We came up with 101 points of essentially what is a resilient business continuity program, what is a best practice gold standard. And each of those 101 points, they fell into one of 8 areas on here. And I'll show you what each of those are. There was program organization, management, and training. So basically, all of the different items that I utilize to get my program started, to get it organized, basically all of the different governance around business continuity planning. So by program organization, you could say things like the budget, all of that different content that you're putting in your plans, your assumptions, your scope, all of your different teams, staffing it, so the organization around that. The training part of it was actually, too, of keeping track of basically of who was getting training on that business continuity program, all of the education around that, and the dissemination of information about the program to all of it, to all your executives, to all of the people that were building your plans and participating in the business continuity program. So that was the first part. The second thing was the business impact analysis. I believe everybody knows what that is. Looking and seeing, basically mapping out and understanding what would be the impact if we took down our operations, determining our recovery time frame objectives, prioritizing what we needed to recover. Emergency response and crisis management. So everything around things like the communication systems and how you're communicating if there's an actual incident going on, all the way through things such as how you would handle all of your people-related issues, your facility-related issues, how you're making the overall decision-making during a disaster, during an outage. Facilities were around all of the different locations that you were utilizing during that particular outage. So it would be the definition of your IT recovery locations, your user recovery locations, and your command center. So command center would be where you're running everything for your crisis management. Your user recovery locations would be where you were continuing to operate your business in that minimal operational configuration. So keeping that business going, which is what Section 5 is. Business and IT disaster recovery, we've combined those together because actually, strangely enough, a lot of the standards did. The business recovery, like I just said, how do you keep up and running when you don't have your normal infrastructure? And then the IT disaster recovery, how do you restore your IT infrastructure, your applications, your data, so on and so forth. Testing, how do you exercise your different plans to ensure that they would actually work during an outage? How are you spotting problems within your particular, the process that you're using, and also your documentation and your plans? How are you remediating that? How often are you testing? What are you testing on there? Are you doing combination tests with the business, IT, and with your crisis management? So things that are covering that. Maintenance, how do you keep your plans up to date? What is triggering a change? How do you track that? And auditing and general policy, how do you evaluate what you've done in your plan? How are you communicating that that has actually been done to both internal and external parties? So by internal, your executives, externally to your customers. So there's really, you can imagine, there was quite a bit of content in there, but it wound up where we were able to break that over those different 8 areas. And that's really how we looked at putting together that genome. Okay, so now, 7 years later, where are we at? And this is really important to understand in terms of lessons learned. One of the biggest things is establishing a framework that stands the test of time. So if you're constantly changing your framework, you can imagine how much work goes into building it. You can see with us, it took us over $300,000 investment and over 10 months converging all of the different content overall into those standards. So the initial 8-month dedication, and then we've been adding on additional standards to our genome on there. So you can imagine like looking at all of the different standards, putting them together and standing the test of time. And one of the great things is that we've only really had to make minor alterations to the original points. They have stood the test of time. What you need to do in, say, like a BIA, or how you're establishing the governance, or those different types of things, essentially when new standards and those new regulations and best practices are coming out, or they're evolving and changing, a lot of those are still the original points of what you need to do and how you need to do it are in essence remaining fairly consistent over the years. So that's really good news. The key thing is basically coming up with that framework to stand the test of time, and we'll show you how to do that. And obviously, the usage of that framework, with such a significant investment for you, needs to be, you need to have that return on investment. We use it in the software product we sell. We use it when we're doing our audit methodology, and we use it when we're doing our consulting, when we're establishing a process, the governance, building plans, exercising them, all of the different activities around there. So a framework really provides a lot of return for us, and I think it can for you and your organization too. Okay, so some of the lessons learned from the framework, from the genome that we've established. And here's where we really get into the meat of this and how you can set up your own framework. was that what's the best process in developing developing a framework? Well, obviously, step one has to be start with what you have to do. You can't get by that. So what we recommend doing is, for step one, start with the regulations that you have to follow internally. And also because of clients. That may not be a regulation on there, but it may be a requirement of a contract. To win this contract, you have to comply or conform to a particular standard on there. So that's the first thing that you want to start with in your framework, what you have to do. The next thing is you want to look at your original framework and then map out some of those different areas. You know, do you care about IT, DR planning? Do you care about how you're doing your exercises? Some people are involved within certain areas of the overall business continuity program. Some people are not. So what you want to do is you want to determine those different areas that you want to address within your framework. And then the next thing is determine, do you want to enhance it? So you compare and you say, do the regulations, are they sufficient in guiding me along within my business continuity program, or do I need to enhance that? So if you do want to enhance it, go on out there beyond what you have to do and find different standards, regs, and best practices that you want to do. And we'll talk about the applicability of where some of the areas that we found where some standards are really great. And how do you map that to a consistent framework? So that's the next thing that you want to do. You know, make sure that you're grouping it in a logical way where it makes it where the framework is easy to update, where it's easy to accommodate additional standards, and where it stands the test of time. Okay. So one of the big things, here's one of the, we're going to do a couple of lessons that we learned on here. One of the things that we saw was that we really, as we were going through, we wanted to look for practical guidance on here. So many of the standards are focusing on basically the setup of the program, structuring it, doing how do I get started, you know, you need assumptions, you need a steering team, you know, the different kind of like, I'm calling that the framework bread. The organization, management, and training, the maintenance, the auditing, and general policy. There is a ton of that within those standards, restated again and again and again and again and again from what we saw. And they pretty much say a lot of the same types of things. What do you need to establish that framework? What types of teams? So that framework bread is plentiful in many of these standards. One of the big things, what I'll call the framework meat in the sandwich on there, how do you actually do the content of your different plans and of your program is a bit harder to find in practical guidance on there. The business impact analysis, yes, you have to do one, but tell me how I need to do it. How are you going to, if I have to be compliant against that, what are the particular points that you're looking for in a BIA? Same thing with a lot of the other ones. You can see on here that with these 4 points, you know, what we're typically calling our plans and also the, you know, the assets that are supporting our recovery, you know, emergency facilities, the IT recovery and supporting our business operations. What exactly are you looking for in there? So one of the big things is really keep an eye out for that, for the meat of the within each of those standards on there. You'll see the other one, you'll probably wind up very easily getting that structure. And we'll show you where you can find that too. So that was one of the big things. What you'll notice is there's a lot of different standards out there. And I'll focus on this bullet point here, plus many, 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 many. I could probably list many's into a couple of other slides in here. There are a ton of standards, best practices, and regulations out there. I have not done a full official count. It is way over 100. And actually, I'll mention this later on, DRJ has a very nice comprehensive list of all of the different standards broken down by industry on there. It may be something that you want to see, especially for regulations. That could be really helpful in looking and saying, gosh, is there anything that I have to comply with? I'm going to go through just a bit of a summary of each of these on here. I listed these because these are some of the ones that we used in the genome, some of the hot ones that are out there right now that we've seen over the last couple of years. And what we'll do is we'll dig into a couple more of these too. The ISO standard 22301, that's the hot standard right now. There are quite a few presentations on this, whole webinars on that, on what ISO means to you. So that's one of the current ones right now. We're going to talk a little bit about that one later on, where some of the strengths and some of the weaknesses are on that. The Federal Financial Institutions Examination Council, or the FFIEC BCP work program, is a standard that's been out for, I believe, about 10 years now, has gone through a couple of revisions. It is something that banks, financial institutions, brokerages, asset management, basically the financial services industry has known for a long time and had to comply, has known about it for a long time, had to comply with it. It has got some excellent content in it as far in all of the different program areas. Depending on who you talk to, it's either the best or the worst kept secret in the industry, that this thing is probably one, if not the best standard out there in guidance for setting up a framework. So we'll talk a little bit more about that too. My background within financial services and with the Treasury Department, of course, this was always front and center to me. But if you're in some of the other industries, you may not have heard of that. I think everybody knows about the DRI and the BCI standards. Nice guidance on professional practices. Basically, overall, with the different program areas that you can address on there, and also it gets some of them, some of the different areas in there get into a little bit more detail in the how-to and setting it up. The National Fire Protection Association, the 1600 standard, a nice focus around crisis management, emergency management, emergency facilities. We'll talk a little bit about that too. That used to be the hot standard a while back. We'll talk a little bit about that too. HIPAA, not a lot of content in there, but very important for healthcare, along with several other standards too around healthcare. So you may want to look at that DRJ site that discusses that. And there's also work groups out there too on LinkedIn and some other places on the internet that specifically talk about the particular standards around both for both health payers and also for hospitals. The GTAG standard, the next one on here, is one that I had actually never heard of before until a couple of years ago. That is one that we've actually seen being used by some of the larger accounting firms in using that as a standard for auditing some of their clients. So that was something that got drawn to our attention doing that. The Basel standards, the 2 and 3, those are more international standards, once again, around the financial services industry, but some nice background on that and good for the framework. The NIST, the SP 800-34, was a standard that actually came out from the federal government on several contracts where you had to conform or comply to that standard if you wanted to do business with certain agencies within the federal government. Very interesting. It was something that some people really knew quite well. That whole 800 series is around a lot of those different points around business continuity management, or what they call COOP planning, continuity of operations planning, the government term. So you can really, there's a lot of good content around that. Some of it's a bit outdated, but it's that guide is primarily, if not all, about IT disaster recovery. You'll see some of the other ones on here, some around the Department of Energy, FEMA 64 guidelines for dam safety, some very interesting things about hazard mitigation. This is kind of a strange one that I would throw in, something that's just around dams and dam safety and security on there. But it was one that really focused on hazard mitigation, and we thought that that was it was a very interesting way that we hadn't seen before in any other standards, where they were getting very specific and how they were doing their risk assessments, what they were mandating, plan formats that they were mandating for the different dams, and also, too, there was combined with FERC and the guidelines that they provide for the recovery plan format. So that was a nice thing to look at, too. The COBIT and the COSO standards, in one of my other talks, we talked about some of the risk management aspects that are in that. That could really help within the BIA and your overall risk assessment, hazard vulnerability assessment. The ASIS standards, and then there's, as you can imagine, quite a bit more on there. The key thing is that you want to go with multiple standards on here. No one of these is going to fulfill everything that you're going to need. So it's a combination of different standards. And I really want to make that point because a lot of times when we're discussing standards, someone says, oh, you forgot this standard, or hey, I use that standard. Keep in mind that a lot of these things are very redundant. It may say, hey, you have to do this for this federal agency in the government, or you have to do this for your bank, or you have to do it this way for as an insurance company. But really what it is that they're essentially saying the same thing. Maybe different constituencies, but really the goal, the point that they're trying to communicate is very consistent across all the different industries. Okay. So one of the big things that we've seen is beware of jumping on the hot standard. That's a big thing. It's the hot standard, and by hot standard I mean if you look at some of the different talks that are going on, or you look at the chat boards, or you look at some of the conferences and things like that, people transfix onto one particular standard. Way back when I did a tour with the National Fire Protection Association on 1600. We went all around and we evangelized what was in there within that standard. And then things started to change. BS 25999. We had PS Prep a little while ago, and now the hot one is ISO 22301. The toughest thing on here is that if you single thread, if you just go with a single standard to establish your framework, in about a year or two, you might not be so happy with doing that. You don't want to go with just that one standard. By combining them together in the thought leadership from the multiple standards in there, what you can wind up doing is that you'll establish a framework that'll stand the test of time on there. Some of the things that we discussed within some, when we went around and we did 1600, I think we realized that we were missing some critical points within some areas on there. So even things that we're going out, and personally promoting, we really have to look and we really have to expand our horizons to establish a framework that's considering those multiple standards. Okay, and lesson number 3. So I'm saying, so don't consider one standard, but what I'm also saying is, too, don't consider them all. You don't need them all. Like we said before, select the regulations with which you must comply and fill in the holes with the other ones, okay, with the other standards and best practices and the regulations on there. So what exactly is it? So now here's the $64,000 question. So now that we have these holes in here, what are the best ways to complete our framework, to fill them in? So that's what we're going to go through next. So what we did was, as we were mapping the particular standards and against each other on here, we were mapping them against the 101 points like we mentioned before. And this is I'm going to give you about a half a minute here to just take a look at this chart. There's a lot of numbers on here. I'll give you just an overview and then we'll get into this. What you can see on here is, these are the 8 sections that we mapped out here. Here's the total number of points out of the 101 that are in each of these different areas. And then here's just some of the standards. We didn't map, you'll notice it's not the 15 across. We just mapped it, we discussed a couple of these on here. And what you can see is how many points each of the standards map to on here. So for example, like NFPA 1600, 12 out of 12 points on here. And what we do is, for things that are high within the different areas, We put those in green for things that are lower. We put those in red on there. So take a, and here's some of the totals down here too of what we found. So we'll give you a little bit of time to just take a look at that, and then we'll go through this. Okay. All right. So one of the big things when we're looking on here, and remember sort of the those different areas, what we wanted to do was we wanted to make a standard that would be good in each of the different areas on here. There was a lot of, as we mentioned before, there was a lot of redundancy. So, some of the things that we saw in the FFIEC were the same in the NFPA standard, the GTAG, the ISO, the NIST. You can see the first thing we'll tell you is that HIPAA doesn't have much content on here. This is important, though, because you have to make sure that you conform with these things. So as far as guidance is concerned, really not much on here. So we'll take that one out immediately. The one thing that I'm sure you've noticed on here is that the FFIEC standard is really good with a lot of the things for the meat of your program on here. So you notice on here you can see the BIA is really nice. The emergency facilities under here, the business and support component recovery, the testing exercise is fantastic. Really nice in how it maps it out. It does it chronologically, and even on the back of the standard, there's the examination program that the auditors at the different organizations, some of the different Treasury organizations, and the federal government are using to assess how well banks and other financial institutions comply with that with that particular standard. So that's really nice. Some of the other things that you want to look at too, obviously putting a framework around how to do a program is really important, especially if you're just starting out. A lot of them will give you some, I think fairly good background and framework in what you need to put in there. Some of the things that are lacking a bit are that how exactly should that look? So in other words, I want a governance statement. I want to say like a budget. Well, do you have a template for me on how to do that? I'll save you the searching through. They don't. They will tell you, hey, you need assumptions and you need scope and you need to have that steering team, and some of them will tell you, hey, it needs to be people of a specific level, certain things like that. As far as some of the practical application, obviously, within some of these things, it can be a bit lacking, but at least it tells you what you need to do. So when you're looking to a standard like ISO is very good with that. The NFPA standard is also good too, and the other ones can help supplement that. Very redundant in here on what's asked for. The BIA is probably, across all the standards, probably the weakest area. And as far as being descriptive on there, they say you have to come up with RTOs or you have to prioritize, and then you say, well, how exactly do you want that done? FFIEC explains that, I would say fairly well, not perfectly. I would say that most of the other standards are kind of lacking. They explain what you need as far as the final work product rather than how you would actually do a BIA. I think one of the challenges is that there's different ways to do a BIA. So actually saying that you have to do it in a specific way may be a little bit risky for some of these different standards to say, hey, you have to do it this way. That may be why they're laying back a bit. As far as emergency response and crisis management, NFPA 1600 is fantastic with that. I mean, you have, fire safety is their background, so they should be good at this. You can see 26 out of the 31 on here, some really great stuff. And obviously, I think within the industry too, there's companies that specifically focus on this too. There's a lot of data There's actually even, as I'm sure almost all of you know, there's even a set system with NIMS that'll give you some great guidance and how to set up a fantastic structure around that. So whereas BIA doesn't say how to do it, if there is one area within the meat of the program, that's one right there. So NFPA is really good with that. You can see emergency facilities on there, the different buildings, how far away they should be, how you should establish some of the assets that go in there and map those out. FFIEC is really good with that. NFPA has some real good things in there too around crisis management. One of the things that we saw, and not to pick on the ISO standard, but really just to point out that it may not fulfill what you need in establishing your framework. Really good with a lot of the stuff, the bread that's around establishing a program, maintaining a program, and auditing the program. But as far as where you're looking at some of the real meat in it, there's really no guidance at all, or it's very limited in there. There is another companion standard, ISO 22313, you might want to look at too, but when you're looking at what's coming out right now, people are single-threading a lot against that ISO 22301, and that's going to leave you, I think, wanting in a lot of those different areas. There's really no mention at all of any type of IT disaster recovery in there. I found that to be very much lacking. But the good part is, like we said before, is that, and even ISO says this at the beginning of the standards, that you're going to want to supplement this. You're going to want to, we're giving you a framework for a business continuity management system. What you want to do is you want to go on in and you want to supplement that with the other standards that are out there, with some of the internal policies and the procedures that you have on there too, some of your internal standards. So it's saying that, hey, listen, it wasn't our intention to give you the end-all, be-all. You may need to supplement that. So right on in there, I just wanted to point that out. So when you're looking for some guidance on that, business and support component recovery, once again, FFIEC, real nice with that. One thing to watch out for in that FFIEC work program is that it's going to be slanted towards financial institutions. So there may be, it's going to describe impact factors that may not be applicable to you, that you may go, what the heck are they talking about? So when we're looking at things like what you're recovering, you know, obviously right now there's a huge focus on liquidity. Does a financial institution, does a bank have enough money on hand? It's a big thing, but you know, obviously for banks, and that's putting it in very, very oversimplified terms there. When you're looking at things, if you're a non-regulated entity, or you know, if you're not a bank, then just watch out for that. So make sure that when you're looking at it, that you take the applicable sections out too on there. So if you don't do it internally, or you don't have a customer that's mandating that you do that, chances are that, you know, some of that may not be applicable to you, especially around that, the BIA and the business and support component recovery, especially within that standard. Testing and exercises, there's quite a few that really map that out quite nicely. There's quite a bit of intellectual collateral too on how to do that. A lot of the things that are going to be recommended on that are going to be the frequency of that testing, who you test with. So in other words, are you doing a joint test with your IT and your business and your crisis management together? Are you testing with your vendors? Are you testing with your customers? It differs in between some of the standards in there. And then you can see on there maintenance and audit and general policy. Not many things on there. There's not really a whole lot that you can say about some of those things. You want to, obviously you need to maintain your program. You need to decide when you do updates and how those are recorded. And then audit and general policy, they basically will recommend, hey, go and use our standard to audit against on there, and that's a good way to do that. I would say go and use your framework and give it to your internal auditors to do that. And they will say, have you done this internally with your organization? So that would be a way that you could satisfy that. If you passed on your framework to your audit team, or even worked with your audit team on this, if you have one, that can also be helpful too. Okay. All right, so as I mentioned before, as far as seeking outside assistance, DRJ, they have an excellent list that, and maybe Bob can actually mentioned something about this at the end of this webinar about. I do not know when the last time it was updated. I believe it was fairly recently, but maybe he can comment on that. And the other thing is too is that make sure there's a lot of there's a lot of marketing claims out there about being, hey, we're compliant with this standard, or we conform to this standard. You can be compliant with the regulation. You can conform to what's in a best practice or a standard on there. Make sure that people can actually map that. So say, all right, show me the points of the standard, and then show me how your software complies. Show me how your audit methodology complies to this or conforms to this. Show me how your consulting methodology does this. So really, the big thing is that, and we've seen this quite a bit through the years, is that people will go in to the compliance standards and they'll find that, oh boy, what I did isn't really meeting everything on there. So it definitely makes sense to match up the output of whether you're doing things in spreadsheets or in software or on stone tablets, whatever it is that you're doing. Compare what your output is of your particular business continuity program to the different standards. It even makes sense to add in another column. So if you're going on in here, you might want to add in a column on here that says, all right, here's what I'm outputting. Here's my process, and here's how it conforms to my framework, and show that. It'll save you a lot of time with your auditors and doing things, and also you'll be able to show to your clients too that, hey, look at this. We conform, we comply with all of these different standards out here. And that's really important for you. And then also, too, you also know that you're doing a good job against your gold standard. You know you're achieving that. Okay. So that is the end of the formal content of the presentation. And I wanted to leave about 20 minutes. And let me look here. Yep, okay, right at the 20 minutes, to answer some questions. So what I'm going to do is I have a little panel here that I'm going to bring up, and I will read through the different questions that have been submitted here. So I'm going to...
And we do have several questions in there for you, Frank. I'm assigning to me and now. Also, if anyone does have any questions, again, please remember you can utilize the question panel found on the right-hand side of your screen. And also take a quick second as Frank's reading through there. If you actually visit drj.com, underneath resources, there's the DRJ Rules and Regulations documents, a nice Excel spreadsheet that our editorial advisory board updates every 6 months. And it was updated, I believe, August, September of last year. So it's very up to date. It's a great tool. You can basically plug in what your vertical is, what areas of the world you're in, and what regulations pertain to your organization. So it's a great resource.
Excellent. All right, and I'll put that, let me put this up here too. I'm sorry, my little questions panel I think is blocking a little bit here. Hold on, let me just move this over a little bit here. Okay. Let's see. I'm going to start with this one. This is a great question. Is there a personal liability for the CEO and CFO if there is a failure to plan? Well, that's interesting. It depends on which standard regulation that you're going up against. I would say when you're looking within financial services, there absolutely is. One of the big things around banking, as you know, that if you wind up where you don't meet the examiner's requirements or they find things that are deficient within your planning process and program, they can actually, it's kind of like, we could probably do like a whole webinar on this, but it's sort of similar to a Sarbanes-Oxley. You have to correct that, you have to attest to that, and you have to get that back to them. Then what they do is they can put you basically under an agreement where you have to fix those deficiencies, and they can there's potential for very significant fines, and even we usually see it combined with some other deficiencies within the financial institution, but where they can actually shut you down. So I think that there's some quite a bit in there that can be problematic. Sarbanes-Oxley is another big one too. It's interesting because, and it's kind of a shame, business continuity planning, management, or with disaster recovery, whatever you want to call it, is a forward-looking control. So in other words, how can you prove that you actually are compliant with something until a disaster happens? So some people, it's interesting. It depends on who you ask. Some people will include that in, some people won't. You have to attest that you are, that the systems that are generating your financial statements are up to par and that can continue, that are, basically generating with data integrity, that those things won't go down, and some of the things around the business continuity program too. So I think that there's definitely quite a few penalties that could happen if you don't meet those standards, especially at that C level. It definitely gets a lot of attention in regulated industries. By regulated, I mean like that financial, healthcare, government. It depends on which agency you're in, but I mean, if you can just imagine if you say, hey, look, the Department of, and I'll put a couple of XXX, a couple of X's in there, not to point anybody out, but to say, hey, you're deficient in your ability to recover and meet your the needs of the communities that you support. You can imagine that can be quite detrimental too. Okay. Okay, let's see what else we have on here. Okay, here's a good one. In starting a new position, would you begin with assessment of their current business continuity program, their current BCP? Absolutely. One of the big things is that I think you need to know what you have and what you need to do. One of the biggest things is you would map out your framework, and then you would see where the different problem areas are and what you need to correct those. We basically, from our perspective, we have an engagement that we do where we look at those 101 points, and we'll look at a current program and see where their problems are. So I think that's absolutely essential to know what you have before you even get started in implementing in your current position. So yeah, absolutely. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so here's one. Here's a statement and a question here. Question for Frank. NFPA 1600 seems to be more of a what to do and not how to do it. Agree. You know what? I would agree on that. But you know what? That's the problem with, I think, it's not just NFPA 1600. I think that's the problem with a lot of these standards. Like I said earlier, I think that there's some reluctance to commit to a certain way to say, hey, you have to do a BIA this way, or even some things like that. There was a lot of issues with how far away should your disaster recovery site be from your normal operational data center. There was a whole thing. Is it 50 miles? Is it 100 miles? And it continuously goes back and forth. I think one of the toughest things is that with different size organizations and different industries and different, I think with different maturities of programs, business continuity programs, it makes it tough to come up with something that's fairly consistent across every single, across every different type of organization. So I would say that I think you definitely, I think there definitely could be more. I think that there definitely could be something that says, you know what, here's a couple of different ways maybe that you could do it. And all of these are good in each of their own ways, so maybe have some of that out there. But also knowing, too, that within each of these standards, there's a lot of work that goes behind these. There's huge committees and to get the consensus and everything, of what needs to be done. So things are fairly slow to move, too, just knowing that. So you may be better off like looking at some other places, too. Okay. Here's a good one. So which regulation are you seeing companies adopt more? I'll tell you, I see a lot of the hot standard is definitely a big thing. Like people will hop on that, and I think there's the reason for that is because that's what we in the industry. I think that's what we wind up where we talk about the most. There's definitely there was a huge amount of play within PS Prep, and a lot of people getting together, discussing the three standards that made that up, and the thought leadership and everything like that. I think also what we see is that some people I think have realized that with that moving target, they're searching for something else. I think a lot of people have classically gone towards that FFIEC work program and done that. I think some other people have actually even established their own standards. There's been several I know insurance companies that have come out with standards in evaluating their insureds and determining rates for things like a BI insurance and things like that. So it's interesting. So I would say it's a combination of a couple of those different depending on who you are and what you've seen is different. Okay, let's see here. Okay, here's actually a really good point on here. One of the participants makes a statement. SOX 409 requires that a firm be transparent about any business impact that causes a material issue. Without a solid recovery plan, a firm may not know what the impact is and may need to report prematurely. So there we go. That's a really important requirement that executives definitely need to be aware of on there, especially if you're a public company and have to comply with that. Okay. Yeah, there's a bunch more questions coming in here, so I got to keep on expanding my window here, and let me just read a couple of these. Oh, here's a great question. Have you seen situations where there are gaps between what the regulations say and what the examiners will inspect? How do you respond or prepare? That's a fantastic question. The answer is yes. And I'll go back to the our FFIEC standard here. It's interesting because right within the beginning of that standard, examiners utilizing that particular work program have the discretion to basically examine and audit how they see fit. That regulation, that standard, it's guidance for that particular examiner to go out and to perform his or her examination. So that could definitely cause some discrepancies on there. I've actually, I'll tell you the one thing. There's actually a really nice presentation that we did around this. There was a gentleman, and I'll release this privately to anybody that's interested in this. It actually wrote up step by step what you do in situations like that, where he was actually he looked at the regulations, he met with the examiner prior to reviews, and many of them were surprise reviews. So he met with them in the beginning of the year and said, "Hey, listen, I want you to show me what you expect out of me," and you'll find that actually a lot of those folks are willing to do that. So I think it's really it's a excuse me. I think it's a very good practice to make friends with your examiner, your auditor, internally or externally, and it's almost like back in college getting it's like, hey, can you tell me some of the questions you might be asking on the test, and get as much of that grill the teacher and get as much of that as possible before you actually go into that particular examination. Okay. Okay. Here's a good question. A little more specific on there. How concrete is the FFIEC guidance around how to perform technology dependency analysis to understand all the underlying IT services required to support critical business apps? There's quite a bit of of technology dependency analysis and how that supports business process. And that's one of the, I think that's one of the big switches that we've seen too, and some of the standards that do talk about business recovery and IT disaster recovery. As everybody knows, very IT-centric. Everybody says a long time ago, although we still see it prevail today, I think in certain pockets of the industry. There was a change made in the FFIEC work program, I believe it was in 2008, to be more business process centric, and then to explain how the information technology and the other, like the people and vendors, basically anything that supported business operation, to really map that out and to understand the prioritization of all those resources. And that's a really key point. What we've seen, and actually this is sort of a corollary off the last question, is that what's something that we see examiners doing? What we see them doing is that they want that methodology, that practice of prioritization of all of the different supporting IT and all the assets and the resources to be objective, to be an objective methodology. In other words, what the heck does that mean? It means mathematical. I want you to show your work. How did you come up with a determination that you needed this application in 1 hour? Was it a revenue loss? Did you consider liquidity, transactional risk, loss of reputation, those different types of things? It provides different areas of IT that you should be looking at, and it's fairly, it's fairly good in saying the different information technology areas on there. Like, it'll say applications and the different network components on there, the different infrastructure, and it actually, I believe, and I'm trying to remember what specific section it is. I think the standard's about 132 pages long. I think there's an appendix in the back. I don't remember which one it is that actually specifically covers all of the different information technology areas on there and how they want that dependency analysis done in the back there. Okay. Let's see here. All right, I think I have time to answer one more question on here. Let me see if there's anything else that I can answer. And if I don't answer your question today, here's my emails right here. And I'm more than happy to post up to some of the different groups out there too. If anybody, if you want to email me and you say, hey, could you post it up to this group for everybody to see, or if you want to ask me privately, feel free to email me here and I can tell you what we found. Okay. Okay. Okay, yeah, there's definitely a lot of, I'll tell you, I don't want to answer these over the phone because I don't want to take sides on one or the other, but one of the big things is that's being asked here, is there a particular organization with the framework we've described where you could get certified and you would conform more to an effective framework than another, so like the DRI and the BCI and everything like that. I'm more than happy to answer those privately on there. Okay, I'll answer this question. This is great. They state that ISO 22301 is replacing the 25999. Does it mean that some of the standards are obsolete and they can be ignored? So that's a fantastic question. So here's one of the we fell into. I believe it was lesson 2. We wrote the hot standard and we mapped out BS 25999. Well, now that we have ISO 22301, do we throw away BS 25999 and just go with ISO 22301? So what exactly what exactly do we do there? My answer is it's really up to you. I would say that both standards, there are some differences in there. I think that ISO served to simplify some of the things in BS 25999, but I don't think that it makes that maybe obsolete as far as like showing conformance. If you go out and you say to somebody, hey, we use BS 25999, they may say, oh, that's an old standard. you really shouldn't be using that anymore. But it doesn't mean that it can't help with your framework. There was a lot of knowledge and I think and work that went into that. So I think it's definitely useful on there. The one thing that we found too is just a one other little extra thing is that these standards you have to buy. A lot of these, and they can cost you. You can really rack up some charges on here. So just be prepared. If you buy ISO 22301, that's I don't know what it is in dollars. I think it was in pounds or in euros. I forget which one it was. But you might be talking about anywhere from like $100 to $200 a standard, maybe even more on some of these things. You can actually join some of those organizations and get them for less. But there's also a membership fee too. So just watch out. Some of them are free out on the internet. The FFIEC one is. So just watch out. You might want to have a little bit of a budget before you go out and you wind up where you buy all these things, because there are copyrights too around all that. So you want to make sure that you're definitely going out and purchasing the standards if you want to get them. So there's it looks like there's about like 25 additional questions on here. I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to answer all of them, but like I said before, definitely email us here. I'm also going to be at SpringWorld giving a talk on risk management, which is going to cover some of those standards too, like I briefly mentioned today. So feel free to come on up to me there, and we also have a booth too. So more than happy to do that. So thanks again.
Wonderful. Thanks a bunch, Frank. And Frank will have actually all the questions emailed directly to him if he wants to follow up directly as well. So thanks again, everyone, here for their attendance here today. We again hope you found some great information from today's webinar. DRJ would also like to thank Frank for his time here today, as well as Strategic BCP for sponsoring today's webinar. We'll be emailing everyone a link to the recording of today's webinar. You may view the webinar as frequently as you wish or share it with your peers. If you do have any additional questions, please contact Disaster Recovery Journal. Thank you again, and this now ends today's webinar.